I think we are now.
Yeah,
Yeah.
we're just getting there. Yes. Yeah, Prashant, you can
Fantastic.
start recording. Yeah.
Great.
Over to you, Professor. Yeah.
So, welcome back. And in order to uh, start with some new material about right, about Ponge. Remember, we were stopping a little short yesterday about Ponge, and Arka was asking about the question of the signature. And it was, I think, with Ponge that Derrida had the most systematic engagement with an author's signature. We saw with his reading of Celan, what he insists upon is how each poem of Celan is signed, but also inserted in a precise moment, precise historical moment, the moment of the author's associations that are at times totally opaque. One could think of many modernist poets who played with that. Eliot, Pound, Yeats, but perhaps for those of you who know Eliot, uh, we have all those characters in the Wasteland, for instance, Mr. Eugenides. Are they really historical figures he met? Are they allegorical figures? There's this Stetson he meets close to his work at the bank. Is that a real person? We don't know. Some are real person. We know Marie Larich. Why is she there? And so this is what Derrida sees in the poetry of Celan. The teeming creatures that appear at times as totally invented, allegorical, or totally real and just mentioned because of a certain occasion. This is only one aspect of Derrida's confrontation with poetry, and this is why I wanted to return to a reading that he has given in several seminars of Ponge, and I think it corresponds to a moment, and I would want to say among Derrida scholars, there are two camps in a sense. Those who think that there are two Derrida. The first Derrida, the Derrida pure deconstruction, and the second Derrida of ethics, politics, and so on. I personally do not think one should oppose two Derridas. One can observe is indeed several modalities of writing, and there is a first Derrida that is indeed very philosophical, and some among his philosopher friends regretted that he didn't remain a specialist, let's say, of Husserl, Heidegger, and phenomenology. And even if he kept returning to phenomenology. And then there is a second mode of writing that is much more experimental. And we'll see this tomorrow with Gla. And it's a moment that I personally would call a modernist Derrida, where really he plays with techniques borrowed from Joyce, Genet, Woolf, many others. And then there are many types of writing that overlap at the end, but one can say that Derrida became much more a philosopher who had an international audience, who was invited all over the world, and was giving lectures absolutely everywhere. When I saw his schedule, I couldn't believe it that he could do that, even when he was very sick at the end of his life. He went on traveling and giving lectures and so on. And so this is the Derrida of the last long texts that come from lectures and seminars he would give at Irvine, NYU, and so on. And so here we have I give the translation used by Derek Attridge in this excellent book that I think maybe would be the one book everybody should have, and actually it's online. You can get it for free. Acts of Literature. That's a wonderful compendium. And there is this text called Psyche. And in that essay, Derrida begins by commenting at great length this little poem, very simple. As again, we see in Forge simplicity, a deliberate simplicity, fable with the word with commences then this text, of which the first line states the truth, but this silvering under the one and the other, can it be tolerated? Dear reader, already you judge there as to our difficulties, parenthesis, after 7 years of misfortune, she broke her mirror. So, as Derrida says, it is a fable about fables, with this reflexive element. He explains, so I wanted to mention this because it's this American Derrida that we need briefly to tackle. The first seminar that I gave at Yale, at the invitation of Paul Deman, who introduced me there, was on Francis Ponge, La Chose, the thing, with the title of this seminar. It continued for 3 years, touching upon a number of related subjects, the death, the signature, the counter-signature, the proper name, and death. To remember the starting point for me, to mime a starting over. And so this is the complex interaction between Derrida and Paul Deman. One cannot avoid mentioning the Paul Deman scandal, and people there again are divided, but one can say that it contributed to a certain rejection of Derrida and deconstruction by many American scholars. Why? The idea was, once it was revealed that Paul Deman had been writing collaborationist texts, some of which were slightly anti-Semitic, not monstrously anti-Semitic, but slightly anti-Semitic. To simplify, there was a link between the way Deman had become a powerful professor at Yale and started a sort of school and had been from the start in admiration of Derrida, but also at times gently critical. Remember that Barbara Johnson, his best student, one might say, played that little game that Paul Deman played a few times with Derrida, that is to turn the tables against Derrida and show that when he was deconstructing, in fact, he had been deconstructed by the text, and therefore his activity was a little superfluous. I would put it like that. Nevertheless, there was a deep friendship between Paul Deman and Jacques Derrida. Are they exactly on the same lines when they talk about text? I don't think so. I personally am not a Demanian, even though I use this text, and some I find absolutely extraordinary. Like Derrida, he had a huge culture nourished from various sources. He would read French, English, German, and Belgian, from an old family with many political figures, some of whom were on the left, actually, were not all on the right. And he had a strange life, fleeing to the United States, as it were, where he was still married, getting married a second time, and doing a number of things that were not exactly kosher, we would say here. And that then after his death, when he was found out that he had lied about his past, there was a sort of suspicion that was, in a way, extended to Derrida, to deconstruction. Derrida, and I agree with this position, even though I think he overdid it, always defended Paul Deman with all the means at his disposal, and perhaps with an intensity that was a little exaggerated, and it took some people away from deconstruction, I have to say. Whenever I mention, even today, that I worked with Derrida, oh, Derrida, Deman, and so on. Are they saying the same thing? Yes, for one moment. And I think what we have here is Derrida being as close as possible to Paul de Man. And on top of that, it's because he's discussing this text that he had chosen, of course, thinking of Paul de Man, invited at Yale. It was a moment when one spoke of a Yale school with Bloom and others who were all at Yale. I have to say that still today, Yale continues the tradition with my friend Martin Hägglund, who is a good Derridian philosopher and has a few excellent books on Derrida. And Hägglund, like me, would not say that there are two Derridas. He rejects the idea that there would be a Nietzschean, playful Derrida in the 60s and 70s, and then a religious philosopher of ethics in the last 2 decades of his life and his career. However, here, what we see if we go down the text is, and so which I think is an important distinction. Derrida, with the extraordinary brio, verbal inventivity, goes on discussing the text disposition, but he has a point. And I think in general, whereas Thomas tends to go back to the text and yield all the power of deconstruction to the rhetorical resources of any text, Derrida is generally taking the text within a philosophical problematic. And here, this philosophical problematic is the question of invention, invention as disposition and art of disposition. But as you can see here, if fable is both performative and constative from its very first line, this effect extends across the whole of the text. This idea is that the text is sort of a paradox about truth. The fact that this text begins by the fact is true. If I write, I have said, sort of reflexive moment, recursive, that is both, according to this analysis, not just a sort of reflection that it is like this, but it creates, so this is a sort of, it pushes the text along, indeed, and pushes the reader to do something about it. And then what is presented as a fable, or the structure of the fable of all fables, a return to the poem, is presented in a parenthesis, and it seems like a sort of little joke of, after 7 years of misfortune, she broke a mirror. Derrida then asks, who is she? And so he answers first, and indeed that was my first reading. If you read it in French, fable, par le mot par, commence donc ce texte, dont la première ligne dit la vérité. Mais ce teint sous l'une et l'autre peut-il être toléré? Cher lecteur, déjà tu juges là de nos difficultés. Après 7 ans de malheur, elle brisa son miroir. I think it's clear that teint, silvering, it refers to a mirror. So the Ponge self-consciously shows that there is a mirror within the text mirroring itself. So then Derrida decides, following another text of Paul de Man, that he is not just the fable, because fable in French is the feminine word, la fable, but following allegories of reading, the sort of text as homage to allegories of reading, figural language in Rousseau, Nietzsche, Rilke, and Proust, a beautiful collection of essays. He says this she is Psyche. And Psyche, as we know, is a mythological character. Let us call the she in this fable Psyche, the one who appears in a metamorphosis of Apelles, the one who loses Eros her betrothed husband, for having wished to see him in spite of the prohibition. It's a well-known mythological moment, and it's been often represented in paintings. Psyche doesn't know that she has married a god, and she cannot see him, but one day she's curious and she has a little candle, and then she sees a super beautiful man, but he vanishes. In French, Psyche is also a big mirror, a big bourgeois mirror. And clearly, Derrida then goes on with all these notions of allegory. He compares Psyche with Mallarmé. He returns, he quotes it several more times. But I would like to say that at the end, he discusses technology, deconstruction, invention, and so on. However, one of the concepts he has deconstructed here, and we'll return to it if you want, is the idea of the performative. Uh, as he shows in a text like this, you cannot distinguish between a constative, which means that you describe the world, describe a state of things, you describe something. This is that. Or today, for me, it's the morning, and for you, it's not the morning, I suppose, and so on. That's a constative. And the performative is something like, now I invite you to speak. So that's a performative, because when I say I invite you to speak, I really invite you to speak. And if I said I prohibit this or that, it would be a performative, as you know. And so this is one of the many examples of how Derrida uses a text. One might say, in general, any text or literature, fiction, and so on. And the text that is, on top of that, aware of it being a text, like Ponge. Before we meet that, and then that there is a passage from Science Ponge that you have read. So this text shows that one needs the concept of a performative, but the concept of a performative will be transformed by being inserted within the realm of fiction. So I can stop it briefly and see whether you respond to my performative invitation by if you have questions about Ponge and signatures and the way Derrida reads him before moving on to my next topic, which is Derrida and Joyce, that I want to follow across a number of texts. The name of the book is Acts of Literature, and it's I think you can find it easily, at least from the US. You can find a PDF of the whole book. It's it begins with a very interesting interview of Derrida by Derek Attridge, in which, among other things, one of the passages that has often been quoted, it's a long introduction, is that Derrida talks about Beckett and says that he is obsessed with Beckett but cannot write about Beckett. So that Beckett has, in a way, anticipated many of his ideas. But you have then the strange institution called literature, the supplement Mallarmé, Before the Law of the Genre, the very long essay on Blanchot, Ulysse Gramophone, Psyche, Science Point, Shibboleth, Aphorism Countertype, and so on. So it's a really, if I were to teach a longer class on Derrida and literature, I would take this as the point of departure.
I've actually put a copy in the.
You have it. Very good. Fantastic. Yeah. I see that. Okay, so if there is no question. I can imagine that you need to be warmed up a little more. And that Ponge is a tricky writer. He is beloved in France. People like him a lot um, because he's always witty and precise and simple at the same time. And it's often the case that there is this tradition in France of it goes back, fable sends us back to La Fontaine. And La Fontaine is a very interesting writer. Um, I mentioned the fact that in France schools, children still memorize some of the fables of La Fontaine. And I think it's still today the only kind of text most people who have a certain education would be able to recite by heart. Two or three, not all, but they are well known. Why is that? La Fontaine, as we know, was a very good poet, writer who wrote actually excellent erotic verse, but decided at some point to write in a sort of classical manner. And what he did, he was just taking the fables that antiquity had given him, Aesop's fables mostly, and a few others. It's a long tradition in Greek and Latin literature. And he simply found absolutely delightfully precise and witty words, and also at times would insert some political critique. And there's a famous fable in which you have the lion who wants to condemn a lamb to death because he's hungry, and the lion finds any kind of excuse and then eats the lamb. And so uh, clearly a sort of critique of the absolute power of the king at that time and so on. But this is the kind of thing that somehow we tend to have lost, perhaps today, the way in which a writer, at least in France and in the US, would take a very basic pattern that is not original and make it interesting just through the play of language. So, to talk a little bit about uh, Derrida and Joyce, this is something that I have discussed many times, as I think I mentioned earlier. Uh, the this was my own, I would say, work with Derrida. I need to share this. With Derrida when I was at the École Normale Supérieure. I it's, okay. You can see a text.
Yes, yes.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. So, uh, what interested me when I first talked regularly with Derrida during my first year as a student at the École Normale Supérieure, when I hadn't yet met Hélène Cixous. And it was actually not Derrida who told me to work with Hélène Cixous, even though they were very good friends. It was the person in charge at the École Normale Supérieure, Mauret. But I first asked Derrida, have you read Finnegan's Wake? And he said, no uncertain term. Yes, I have read Finnegan's Wake. He didn't give any details, but I learned later that he had indeed, while being an exchange student at Harvard, and when he was supposed to work on Husserl, which he did, he was in fact taking a seminar on Finnegan's Wake and on Joyce. So read all of Joyce then, and finding perhaps Joyce more exciting than Husserl, which I can indeed understand. If you've tried to read Husserl, he's a great philosopher, but extremely dry, slow, grinds concepts and so on. You read Joyce, it's a feast, and you laugh and so on. So this is a little bit what explains the relatively surprising presence of Joyce so early in the work of Derrida. So, and also, of course, his friendship with Hélène Cixous, that had started much earlier. He knew very well that Hélène Cixous was writing the first important dissertation in French on Joyce. Um, what I also know, and this is interesting, was that Hélène Cixous at first wanted to write a dissertation on Shakespeare. And she was told, no, there are too many dissertations on Shakespeare. So then she said, okay, I'll write a dissertation on Joyce. People said, no, you cannot write on Joyce. A woman cannot write on Joyce. He's too pornographic. Even then, the French believed that he was a little pornographic. She insisted and found a superior mind, Jean-Jacques Mayou, who I heard speak when I was at the École Normale Supérieure on Beckett. He was a great Beckett specialist and a friend of Beckett, and also a great Joyce specialist. And so she indeed wrote on Joyce. And as we know, Derrida and Cixous would really be more or less talking every day and talking a lot about Joyce, what she was doing on Joyce. However, it was at an early moment, Derrida was trying to think the way in which language is perhaps something that is essential to phenomenology. Derrida wanted to deal with the question, is the historicity of science like mathematics, geometry, an essential factor, or is the mathematical foundation of idealities a condition of possibility beyond history? To answer the question, as originally posed by Russell, Derrida slips in literature, a theme used as a springboard for the problematic of cultural traces, since writing, defined as a practice of difference, appears most strongly with Joyce. Husserl had anticipated this move. This comes to the fore in a footnote in which he, Husserl, insists on the need to keep a record of scientific invention through language. And Husserl himself grants literature a surprising preeminence. I quote the text and the note. Geometrical existence is not psychic existence. It does not exist something personal within the sphere of personal consciousness. It is the existence of what is objectively there for everyone. You see, the interesting point, and people still wonder how come Derrida started his philosophical career with a translation of a short text of, say, 50 pages by Husserl and an introduction of 200 pages or so, and a text that is apparently on a minor problem, geometry. Why geometry as a key issue in philosophy? As you can understand, it is linked at the same time with Derrida's reading of Plato, side by side with his reading of Husserl. Why? As you may know, for Plato, there is the question of what he calls eidos, that is translated at time by form, at time by essence, form, essence. And often in Socrates' dialogues or in the text that are less dialogues, but more sort of philosophical problematic, the model for the definition of an essence is the difference between a geometrical figure, like a triangle, and the definition of the figure. You can define a triangle, you can define a circle in terms that are written, as it were, or spoken, or you can write on the blackboard. A triangle is made up of 3 lines and 3 angles, triangle, and it is true of all triangles, whether they have this or that shape. So geometry plays a very important pedagogical function because it's something that everybody agrees upon. Yes, indeed, I can do any kind of triangle, but the concept of the triangle remains the same. Then I can specify right triangle and all the names of the triangles we find in various, in Euclid, and so on. But fundamentally, for the Greek mind, geometry and Euclid geometry, we can say more precisely, a geometry that Joyce knew. And I'll return to that. Euclid is mentioned quite systematically by Joyce, plays a function of a science. You can say it is scientific. It is connected with mathematics because we can then have for the circle, pi, famous number, an irrational number that the Greeks had found and was there from the start. And all the constructions we can find in Euclid, the transposition, the calculations of the angles, and so on. All this is a very basic science, but it can be used philosophically. And the question, of course, for Husserl is, when we think triangle, do we need to use that tradition, Euclid and so on, or do we simply have a pattern in our mind? And this is what he called the geometrical existence. When we go to school as children and we start playing with circles and compasses and so on and making measures. And so Husserl adds all forms newly produced by someone on the basis of pre-given form immediately take on the same objectivity. This is, we note, an ideal objectivity. It is proper to a whole class of spiritual products of the cultural world to which not only all scientific construction and the sciences themselves belong, but also, for example, the construction of fine literature. Fine literature. And here you have a note. And let's not forget that this is the translation by Derrida. But the broadest concept of literature encompasses them all. That is, it belongs to their objective being, that they be linguistically expressed and can be expressed again and again. Or more precisely, they have their objectivity, their existence for everyone, only as signification, as the meaning of speech. This is true in peculiar fashion in the case of the objective sciences. For them, the difference between the original language of the work and its translation into other languages does not remove its identical accessibility or change it into an inauthentic, indirect accessibility. The remark about translation is crucial. Husserl is above all interested in the possibility of preserving a fixed nucleus of meaning that can be transmitted, which is why a common language, common definitions, and agreement about those definitions would be indispensable to geometry. Derrida stresses in his commentary, it is curious to see that here geometry provides a model for literature, not the reverse. I quote him, every linguistic dimension that would escape this absolute translatability would remain marked by the empirical subjectivity of an individual or society. For Husserl, the model of language is the objective language of science. A poetic language whose signification would not be objects will never have any transcendental value for him. So Husserl relies on a model of transferability, and happily this soon meets limits as soon as one addresses the constitution of subjectivity or its dependence on language. And this is indeed the key project of phenomenology. Here, as quite often, and let's remember that Derrida was a very young scholar when he started writing, Derrida does not hesitate to contradict Husserl, especially when Husserl seemed to be longing for a nature as origin or ground for pre-cultural identities. But pre-culturally, pure nature is always buried. So at the ultimate possibility for communication, it is a kind of inaccessible infra-ideal. Can we not say then just the opposite of what Husserl said? Are not non-communication and misunderstanding the very horizon of culture and language. Undoubtedly, misunderstanding is always a factual horizon and a finite index of sound intelligence taken as an infinite pole. But although the latter is always announced so that language can begin, is not finitude the essential which we can never radically go beyond. Here you can see first how Derrida is Heideggerian, finitude, and so on, but also we can say close to psychoanalysis in a sense, since it was psychoanalysis that insisted on the idea of misunderstanding, non-communication, and the fact that, as Lacan was saying at that time, as soon as we have signifiers, the meaning of the signifiers is not the same for all. Here, Derrida abandons the mask of the good pupil who carefully annotates the text, is translated, and lets a different tone to be heard, a tone closer to Heidegger and Blanchot. See, the idea that the latter pole of infinity, so that language can begin, is something that I would want to compare with what we saw of Roland Barthes writing Degree Zero. Husserl does not disregard language in his essay. And there is a passage, so this is where we enter, I think, in the original nexus of Derrida's main insight. And it was really, and I admire that in a way, was really because he had quite simply to translate a relatively simple text. And he could have just translated, say, oh, yeah, Husserl betrays prejudice, and that's the times, and so on. No, he goes on and he pushes and he questions and he goes further. And then, indeed, his introduction is not an introduction. It's like twice as long, 3 times as long. And this is what he tended to do with all these earlier texts. Read a little text that betrays something, and then you have to dig and expand and explode. Husserl takes the example, and this is Husserl, of the word lion, Löwe, to conclude that this word is both an ideal objectivity, ideale Gegenständlichkeit, and something that is given a linguistic living body, Sprachleib, which is a surprising term, Sprachleib. Leib is one of the many words German has to speak of the body. It's more a body of affect, Leib, rather than Körper, which is the body of science. And this language exists objectively only in virtue of two-level repetitions and ultimately in virtue of sensibly embodying repetitions. I will talk later on about the term that Derrida keeps referring to, iterability, the iter, and that language, one of the fundamental features of language is that it is made up of repetition. I can repeat what a dictionary gives to me. I can repeat what people say. I learn language by repeating what people say around me, and so on. Like Euclid's theorems, which remain identical throughout all translations, Löwe, lion, belongs to a universe common to humanity. Civilization is the community of those who, by speaking, can not only name the world, but share the world. Writing makes this communication become virtual, anticipating the idea that language is sedimented. Sedimented means that there are many, many layers, and that in spite of the requirement of pure university, without which a science would not be rigorous, like again, my example of a triangle. See, if we don't know what an angle means, or a line, even, let's say somebody who is blind, maybe, would not have a definition of the triangle. Uh, uh, so, a scientific discovery would not made by avoiding the seduction of language, but by taking into account the specific passivity implied by tradition. The rest of Husserl's essay is devoted less to geometry than to problems posed to him by tradition and history. And what he wants to know is, do we need to know the names of the inventors of, let's say, figures in the tradition of geometry? And indeed, I guess we don't. We can go back to Euclid's Elements. He's always referring to Euclid, but why is it that we have kept the name of Euclid and not of all the obscure Archimedes, we know, who was also a Greek mathematician who left his name, but there are exceptions. Generally, we don't know the names of the people who have invented equations and so on. Even if Husserl attacks historicism and its fascination for analyze raw facts and sees Hegel primarily as a historist philosopher, Derrida points out deep similarities in Husserl's and Hegel's treatment of language. And we see this in another footnote. So this is the text. The text, thus the word has an ideal objectivity and identity, since it is not identical with any of its empirical, phonetic, or graphic materializations. It is always the same word, which is meant and recognized through all possible linguistic gestures. Insofar as this ideal project confronts language as such, the latter supposes a spontaneous neutralization of the factual existence of the speaking subject of words of the thing designated. Speech, then, is only the practice of an immediate eidetic. Eidetic, meaning that for Husserl, speech is the realization of an intention of my conscience, looking at something like an eidos, the term used by Plato, that is a form. Like this is the root of what Derrida will later attack as vouloir dire. You mean to say, I want to speak of a lion because I have a lion in my mind. I see a lion and I am looking for the word. And so this is the Husserlian idea. I want to talk about the lion. I am in Berlin and I'm looking for the words for lion, Löwe in German. So here is the footnotes. I have it in French and in English. The linguistic neutralization of existence, it's an original idea only in the technical and thematic signification that phenomenology gives it. Is not this idea the favorite of Mallarmé and Valéry? Hegel, above all, had amply explored it. Why Mallarmé? Because Mallarmé had this famous image of, I say, a flower, and the word flower abolishes all actual flowers. And Mallarmé understood that the poetic gesture of nomination was also an idealization. The flower in the poem is the death of all the flowers in the world, as it were. Hegel, above all, had amply explored it in the Encyclopedia. One of the few Hegelian works that Husserl seems to have read, The Lion already testifies to this neutralization as an exemplary martyr. Quote, confronting the name lion, we no longer have either an intuition of such an animal or even an image, but the name, when we understand it, is its simple and imageless representation. In the name, we think. And this is here um, cited by Jean Hippolyte, Logique et Existence, Essai sur la logique de Hegel. And we've seen that Hippolyte was his friend and mentor of Derrida and the director of the École Normale Supérieure, a famous Hegelian. A work which on many points led the profound conversion of Hegelian and Husserlian thought appear. And indeed, one, this is a very beautiful book, Logique et Existence, superb book that I think paves the way to Derrida. Hegel also writes, the first act by which Adam is made master of the animals was to impose on them a name. That is, he annihilated them in their existence as existence, system, and so on. But what is interesting is cited by Maurice Blanchot in La Part du Feu. I'll return to that text, La Part du Feu, to that collection that Derrida, we know, read extremely carefully, in which Blanchot goes back to Hegel to produce something slightly different. If Hegel and Husserl agree when affirming that the word is the death of the thing, however, the dramatization of the negativity of language that we hear through Hegel and Blanchot is foreign to Husserl's more technical idiom. Derrida quotes here literature and the right to death, which closes La Part du Feu, the work of fire, an essay provided the theoretical of the core of the book and consists largely of a reading of Hegel. For Blanchot, writing in 1949, Kojève was still an authority on Hegel. Kojève is quoted as having shown how Marx and Hegel agree fundamentally and having demonstrated that understanding is the equivalent of a murder. Blanchot alludes to Hippolyte, Genesis and Structure of the Phenomenal Spirit, when he points out that the main discovery in Hegel's phenomenology is not slavery, I mentioned that in passing, but the terror during the French Revolution. On the whole, Blanchot takes Hegel as a point of departure to explore the paradoxes that any writer faces, the first being the impossibility of really beginning. As you may know, this is one of the paradoxes pointed out by Hegel in the beginning of the phenomenology of spirit. How can one begin knowing when one doesn't know? There is a sort of, from the start, possible aporia for Hegel. And the answer is just do it, and then you'll see. On the whole, Blanchot takes Hegel as a point of departure to explore the paradoxes that any writer faces. Beyond these references, another reference looms larger in Blanchot's text, Levinas, who provides not so much a way out as another terminology that allows him to move away from the Hegelian pathos of negativity. And so I quote here, Blanchot, literature, this blind vigilance which, wishing to escape from itself, falls deeper and deeper into its own obsession, is the only available translation of the obsession of existence, if the latter is the very impossibility to leave existence, being that is always thrown back to being, which in the depthless depth is already at the bottom, abyss, which is still a foundation for the abyss, recourse without which there is no recourse. This is the abysmal foundation for Blanchot given by Levinas. I mentioned this concept of Levinas of il y a, there is, it is there, a sort of night that is also the night of the neutral. Of course, we know the links between Blanchot, Levinas, and Bataille in the text that Derrida read closely. He found this quote of Hegel. In it, the impact of Levinas' thought is perceptible. We know that Derrida's introduction to Husserl's geometry was written just 1 year after totality and infinity. I remember that for Levinas, phenomenology is a sort of Odyssean quest, an imaginary adventure uh, uh, that are undergone only to go back home. In the introduction to Husserl, then having been reminded by Levinas that phenomenology, Husserl's phenomenology, uh, would also be some kind of odyssey. Derrida think, oh, what about another odyssey? Uh, and the Odyssey of Joyce. This historicity or traditionality is always presupposed by every Odyssean repetition of Joyce's type, as by all philosophy of history, in the current sense, and by every phenomenology of spirit. The essences of finite totalities and the typology of figures of the spirit will always be idealities that are bound to empirical history. uh, we know that here, Derrida, we need a little more time, and this is the text I began discussing, text on Levinas, uh, uh, to digest Levinas's conflation of Hegel's phenomenology spirit with Greek philosophy. What Blanchot brings to Derrida is the awareness that any work will surprise its writer, and the sense that writing is the name of a process by which I becomes other. For Blanchot, literature is simply the replacement of the I by a he or she, the third person. Even if one thinks one says I, when one writes, one becomes a he or she or they these days. This is not far from the remark quoted in Introduction to Husserl about the possibility of considering writing as an archive, or, as Jean Hippolyte, a subjectless transcendental field. And so writing as the place of absolutely permanent ideal objectivities, and therefore of absolute objectivity, certainly constitutes such a transcendental field. I'm not sure whether you are aware, all of you, of what transcendental means. Transcendental is Kant's vocabulary, but it has been taken up by Husserl. And transcendental means a priori, foundational framing, without which nothing else can be said or done. Of course, for Kant, language was not part of the transcendental analytic of pure reason. He didn't think in those terms. What Derrida is trying to show is that Husserl is almost going to assert that language is a transcendental form, that without which, so the question of the transcendental is, without that, nothing else is possible. It is a condition of possibility. So if Husserl says language is a condition of possibility, then what does he mean by language at this point? And what is the place of writing in his conception of language? This is the main problem that Derrida was tackling then. And indeed, at that time, writing is a new concept, and in a number of essays written around that time, Derrida was trying to combine a structuralist demand and a genetic demand, and you find echoes of this in his work on the origin of geometry. And there is this question of what is the condition of language. Husserl has recourse to another kind of odyssey. If reason leads us to speech as auto-affection meaning I hear that I am affected by myself, the first simple experience is, do I hear myself speak? We know that, or we could say, to take another example, do I hear myself sing? Or do I need a machine to realize what my voice sounds like? Do I hear myself in a way? And we know that such a simple question, even for um, scientists, psychologists, and so on, is not absolutely a given. As you may know, there are many, many tests about this. And generally, when people are recorded speaking and then they are given other tasks in between to make them forget what they have said. And perhaps later in the day, they are asked to assess the quality of the voices. In most tests that I've done, at least I read that some time ago, um, people will be asked to grade the voices in terms of pleasantness or unpleasantness. And all of them would say that the most unpleasant voice was their own voice that they didn't recognize. So, and we know also in the pathology of singing or in the pathology of deafness that there are many problems in between speaking and hearing oneself speak, as you may have heard from people who are absolutely deaf, generally from birth. There is something in their voice that is a little different and show that they do not hear themselves speak. So this is one of the key issues for Derrida. In emerging from itself, hearing oneself speak constitutes itself as the history of reason through the detour of writing. Thus, it differs from itself in order to reappropriate itself. So that's how Derrida sees not only Husserl, but Hegel. That's the phenomenology of spirit somehow. The phenomenological structuralism that is strategic since it makes it possible to point out the paradoxes and difficulties involved by the links between intentionality. Again, intentionality for Husserl is when I see in my mind an image of a lion. I want to say lion, and I find the word lion, and I say lion. And the linguistic flesh, the graphic body. With this, the possibility or necessity of being incarnated in a graphic sign is no longer simply extrinsic and factual in comparison with ideal objectivity. It is the sine qua non condition of objectivity's internal completion. Therefore, the act of writing is the highest possibility of all constitution, a fact against which the transcendental depth of ideal objectivity's historicity is measured. One question remains. When tracing the convergence of Husserl and Hegel in their idealizing strategies, and remember how Derrida would attack Lacan for being idealizing like Hegel, and that's one of his reproaches to Lacan, that Lacan is too Hegelian. He was aware of being Hegelian indeed. Joyce, who is nevertheless, as we saw, for Derrida, the most Hegelian of all writers, adding perhaps as a saving clause, is presented as an alternative to phenomenology's idealizing gesture. Why not, instead of Joyce, allude to Heidegger to promote this internal questioning of phenomenology? Why is the Irish writer needed at this juncture? In the introduction to the origin of geometry, Joyce is called upon as much as the author of interconnected puns that make Finnegan's Wake a perfect pastime for retired linguists as the launcher of an Odyssean repetition. However, Derrida is reluctant to identify Joyce's project with that of pure historicism. He knows that Stephen Diderot's deepest wish is to wake up from the nightmare constituted by history. From the turning point in the introduction to the origin of geometry, Joyce acquires a monumental and emblematic stature. Joyce embodies a radical alternative to phenomenology. While Husserlian phenomenology condenses the fundamental desire of philosophy, that is, a desire to reduce the equivocation of everyday speech to the university of mathematics or geometry, Joyce allegorizes the whole of literature in its struggle with history. As Derrida recalls, in a condensed manner in 2 words for Joyce, a talk presented 20 years after the introduction, Joyce is less the great novelist of the modern period than an author to whom an entire philosophical program can be ascribed. See, and so this is into it. The other great paradigm would be the Joyce of Finnegan's Wake. He repeats and mobilizes and babblizes the asymptotic totality of the equivocal. Note this complex structure, asymptotic totality. Asymptotic meaning that one is always almost reaching it, but never reaching it fully, because it is the totality of equivocation. It is the totality of culture and universal history, as Joyce puts it, via Vico and others, but as in Vico, access through puns and misunderstandings about language. He babblizes the asymptotic totality of the equivocal. He makes this his theme and his operation. He tries to make outcrop with the greatest possible synchrony at great speed, the greatest power of the meanings buried in each syllabic fragment, subjecting each atom of writing to fission in order to overload the unconscious with the whole memory of man. Mythologies, religion, philosophies, sciences, psychoanalysis, literatures. That's a perfect paragraph to define what Joyce is doing with Finnegan's Wake. One can see that Derrida really understands the project of Finnegan's Wake. What I call a hyperbolic style, see how strong it is needed to dramatize the impact of no less a hyperbolic project. Joyce's wish is to create a new language from about 70 idioms, and it is a meditation not only on Babelization, the Tower of Babel, but also the flood. In this torrential verbal downpour, Joyce the Demiurge is replaced by an almost nightmarish version of a totality, closer to Dr. Mabuse or to Roland Barthes' remarks on the monster of totality, repeatedly denounced in Roland Barthes by Roland Barthes. The truth is that Joyce does not limit his enterprise to mobilizing the totality of culture. He both demobilizes, and here I'm alluding to that image of Levinas, that Joyce demobilizes, that we don't know what to do. We don't know who to fight against whom, and immobilizes. What distinguishes Joyce is that he refuses the nuclei of meaning that for Husserl are necessary to translate languages. And then again, this generalized equivocality of writing does not translate one language into another on the basis of common nuclei of meaning. It talks several languages at once, parasiting them. Indeed, this is, and we'll return to this, the key issue here for Derrida is the possibility and impossibility of translation. And indeed, if you know a little bit Finnegan's Wake, it seemed that this is a text that is impossible to translate. However, it's been translated, nevertheless, in most languages, even in Chinese. At the same time, one can say that these translations are generally rewritings. In 1962, when Derrida was discussing Husserl, Joyce appeared at the end of a list of literary references after Goethe's Faust, quoted by Husserl as an example of literary ideality. One meets Valéry, Mallarmé, Blanchot. And this is in the context of what an important philosopher, a bit forgotten today, but very important, Gaston Bachelard, who worked a lot on the dialectics of science and poetry, as a great reader of poetry. called the bibliomenon in a bibliomen in sort of invention, the being of the book, this instance of printed thought whose language is not natural. Husserl was aware that writing defines and completes the ambiguity of all language. Among the group of philosophical writers who drop literature like a brick on the experience of pure thinking, Joyce adds to Husserl the counterweight of a writing that is not just bound in culture, but also unbound. Joyce's writing is unbound in the sense that its chains of links belong to empirical systems, from the accidents of spelling, from local accents to hazardous weavings of myths, religions, and found historical narratives. And so this uh, his writings make the structural unity of all empirical culture appear in the generalized equivocation of a writing that, no longer translating one language into another on the basis of their common cause of sense, circulates through all languages at once, accumulate their energies, actualizes their most secret consonancies, discloses their furthermost common horizons, cultivate the associative synthesis instead of avoiding them, and rediscovers the poetic value of passivity. In short, rather than put it out of play with quotation marks, rather than reduce it, this writing resolutely settles itself within the labyrinthian field of culture, bound by its own equivocations, in order to travel through and explore the vastest possible historical distance that is now at all possible. See, what Joyce embodies here is exactly the reverse of what is Husserl's main method, that is reduction, the idea of reduce. Husserl often works by bracketing off unnecessary features of, let's say, an object, an attitude, and so on, to reach a sort of basic form that will be the essential feature he wants to analyze. That's what he calls reduction. Joyce, on the contrary, never reduces. He multiplies, he adds, he add layer on layer, and so on. And we know indeed, for those of us who have looked at the manuscripts of Finnegan's Wake, how much Joyce started with little text, one might say at times little fables, and then would add meaning, graph things, and so on, until in the end, there are so many allusions that you don't really know where to begin. What is presented by Derrida is not, and this is an important point for me, is not a philosophical reading of Joyce. That reading has been done, and for instance, among Joyce scholars today, there is a real discussion about what Derrida seemed to assume, that Joyce was a Hegelian. Was he Hegelian? Was he Aristotelian? And so on. Again, I'm quoting the text on Joyce. It is not by chance that there is no phenomenology of the idea. The latter cannot be given in person. Sorry, the text on Husserl geometry. For it's only the possibility of evidence and openness of seeing itself. It's only determinability as the horizon for every intuition in general, the invisible milieu of seeing, analogous to the diaphanity of the Aristotelian diaphanous and elemental third, but the one source of the seen and the visible. By diaphanous, I mean what is visible and yet not visible in itself, but rather owing its visibility to the color of something else. It is thanks to this alone that the color of a thing is seen. One might think here that Derrida is about to embark on a commentary on a very famous passage in Ulysses at the beginning of chapter 3 called Proteus, we see, we hear rather Stephen Diderot's thoughts while he's walking along the sea on the beach, and he meditates on the act of seeing. And actually, he quotes exactly the same passage that Derrida was quoting, De Anima 418b. You probably know it. I'm not sure whether you read it. Ineluctable modality of the visible, at least that, if no more, thought through my eyes, snot green, blue silver, rust, colored signs, limits of the diaphragm. But he adds, in bodies. Then he was aware of them bodies before of them colored. How? By knocking his cons against them, sure. Go easy. Bold he was, and a millionaire. Maestro di color che sanno. Limits of the diaphragm in. Why in? Diaphragm. A diaphragm. Um, as you may know, this refers to the idea you have in Aristotle that uh, the bodies are perceived, that we have, we see bodies as limited by colors, and the bodies are colored. And here, uh, uh, Joyce is referring to not only Aristotle, but Bishop Berkeley, who was also rethinking vision and knocking his cons with a refutation of Berkeley's immaterialism uh, by Johnson. How do I know that there is a stone? I kick it, I hit it. Bold he was and a millionaire. This is Aristotle, who was supposed to be rich and bold, and is referred to through Dante, Maestro di color che sanno, which is the term used by Dante at the beginning of Inferno, when Dante the poet meets Aristotle as the king of philosophers, and he is the master of those who know. In a subtle, ironical way, Joyce quotes this in Italian to leave color, those who, as echoing color in English. So you see here already the kind of allusion that, of course, for Husserl would be totally gratuitous and obfuscating. And this is how Joyce plays with culture. And Husserl would say, why don't you say Aristotle instead of referring to Dante? But of course, for Joyce, the point is to show us how Stephen Diderot's mind works, always quoting things, always full of allusions to Dante, Aristotle, medievalism, you might say. So Derrida needs Joyce as showing what writing means, writing in action, the performative nature of writing as such. Joyce's polyglottism is anti-historical historicism, his generalized equivocation, his encyclopedic hubris are factors that define the global program shared by high modernist poets and artists. The point is not to establish a philosophical dialogue, like the dialogue between Husserl and Heidegger. I think that Joyce is introduced here because he cuts the dialogue in a way. Joyce's answer is a performative by showing to you that literary language is virtually unbounded, infinite, and it plays on. This is so. Here, I will go faster. We have talked about this, the links between um, Eliot's conception of tradition and Husserl's conception of tradition and Derrida's conception of tradition. It would be too long to develop, and I'd like to take some questions if you have. Uh, but I'd say that indeed, as I mentioned earlier, not only had Derrida read Eliot as well, but meditated on Eliot on history, Eliot on tradition, and this idea of the historical sense that is so important for Eliot, a sense that is based on the present, but a present opening that opens itself to the layered function of language. What is important to remember is, so I'll stop my sharing of this particular text, and this is one of the too many texts I've written about Joyce and Derrida, or Derrida's readings of Joyce, and we will come to another soon, Ulysse Gramophone. But I would like simply to say that fundamentally, you see here from the start of Derrida's career, you have the model of science and philosophy and a certain way of thinking rigorously. And I believe personally that one needs philosophy, uh, even when one is a literary critic. We cannot avoid philosophy. Why? Because philosophy is precisely a way of defining concepts as rigorously as possible. We cannot just be always in jokes, puns, equivocation, and so on. However, the writing of someone like Joyce, it's not only Finnegan's Wake, in Finnegan's Wake, it's radicalized to sort of absolute intensity, but even in Ulysses and elsewhere, and I would say of every poet we've read so far or mentioned, even in Ponge, we saw that even when the language is as simple as possible, you have all those meanings and you hesitations. Who is she in the poem fable? We see it left on purpose open for the reader to invent something and invent a solution. So this is what literary language brings to the fore. This other way of using language, which is via, and so this was Joyce's main discovery, the discovery that the ambition of phenomenology to reach university will always be defeated by literature. So, yes, I have a question. Please explain the point of contradiction of Derrida and Husserl regarding geometry. I'm not sure whether I understand the question, what is meant by point of contradiction. If you can just explain what you mean by point of contradiction. I think uh, Derrida and Husserl uh, agree in a way about the function of geometry. They don't disagree. Uh, Geometry uh, there is, if you mean by this contradiction between Derrida and Husserl, it is not about geometry. They agree that geometry provides a sort of easy pattern for the definition of idealities. Okay, yes. Oh, no problem. No, you can ask. Um, uh, you can stay, of course. Anybody can stay in that discussion. But so to return to Anita's question, see, this is why geometry is so important here. Uh, um, here, and I'm talking to people who may not know Derrida, but who may know Joyce. It's something that I have been discussing more recently in a book in French on Joyce that I might or might not write in English if I have the time. We'll see. I suppose some among you know the beginning of Dubliners, Joyce's collection of stories. And in Dubliners, you may remember that Joyce uses this word that I send, gnomon, gnomon. It's not unclear how to pronounce it, gnomon. You have the narrator, a young boy who thinks of the word paralysis and simony and gnomon. And gnomon is sent to Euclid. Okay. So it's a proof that Joyce was interested in the question of geometry, because indeed it is in Euclid's Elements of Geometry that you have in book 2. Look at it. It's fascinating. I have to say, I've always been fascinated by this, maybe because my grandfather, my paternal grandfather, was a mathematics teacher. And when I was a very young boy, I spent some time in his house, and I don't remember anything he said to me, but he tried to teach me when I was 2 about post-Euclidean geometry, and I think I've been completely lost. But anyway, this is just to say that geometry is fascinating. The the question for Joyce. And so, what is Joyce doing with this gnomon? Gnomon, if you look it up in the Euclid, is a very particular figure. That's a sort of parallelogram from which you take one angle. But what makes the gnomon interesting for Euclid is that you take from the parallelogram a shape that is the equivalent, but smaller, of the whole shape of the parallelogram. And so the gnomon, which has a connection in Greek with gnosis, meaning to know, knowledge, to understand, is also a figure of incompletion. And in the story itself, the link with the plot of the story is that the narrator is trying to see whether an old friend of his, a sort of mentor for him, an old priest who was paralyzed, has died, and he passes every day in front of the window, and he is looking for signs, and he knows that if the priest has died, he's very sick, there will be something like a darkened window or light and so on. So he's looking at the signs, and this is indeed one of the meanings of gnomon. But I'm interested that in the fact that one of the most famous and often taught stories of Joyce, the first story of Dubliners, easier to read indeed than Ulysses of Finnegan's Wake, begins with this kind of weird geometry of the gnomon, and I think if you've read it, you must have seen in your edition annotations of Euclid and so on. But take a closer look if you are mathematically minded, because you will see that what Euclid does with the gnomon is very complicated. There are many calculations, and one can say, so this is what interested me, and I hadn't really understood it until some time ago, that with a simple figure like the gnomon, we have what is called mathematical geometry, the mathematization of geometry. That is when, instead of taking a number of simple tools like a compass for the circle, you have a structure, a pattern that is complex enough that you need to use mathematics to calculate proportions and so on. And the other consequence is that within those proportions, you have the idea of mise en habit, that is a little shape that is the equivalent of a larger shape, That is how a sort of infinity is created by regression. So I have a question from Protici. Derrida uses Joyce to show how literary language is unbounded and infinite. But the introduction to Survey, he mentions how Joyce takes responsibility in the face of equivocality to repetition. Repetition happens when there are limitations, right? if literary language is infinite, then would it not remove the need for iterability? Ah, that's an interesting question. Uh, Joyce takes responsibility in the face of equivocality through repetition. Uh, I'm not sure that I would say exactly that. Uh, in a way, we have to remember, and this is something that Derrida was quite aware of since um, the seminar he took at Harvard on Joyce, paid a lot of attention to Giambattista Vico. Vico is a philosopher of history, but he is the first philosopher who understands that history is conditioned by language. But when he says language, so this is the fundamental discovery of Vico, he says poetic language, fables, myths. For Vico, one should read, let's say, Homer, Ovid, all those legends, that even those I was mentioning earlier, via Ponge, Psyche, Eros, all the tradition, what people in Vico's time, in the 18th century, and even in Derrida's time, and even in my time as a young man, we would have to learning Latin and Greek. If you do Latin and Greek, you will have to know all the names of the heroes, the gods, the demigods, and so on. This kind of proliferating mythology that is so important for a lot of English and American literature, at least in poetry. And so on. So for Vico, all those characters, beginning, of course, it begins with Jupiter, the main god. All these characters can be understood as betraying a certain state, a moment of a social evolution. And for him, Jupiter is the father, use father, who invents use, that is the law of the common law, and so on. So in Vico, you have already this idea that any noun and any name, so the names of the ancients, will be read like puns, as it were. Jupiter, Zeus' father, they condense things. Uh, and uh, and so Vico is, of course, often wrong in his reconstruction. He didn't know enough languages, but quite often he tries to translate a proper name into a certain series of nouns. So this is a sort of historical equivocation. This corresponds to what Vico called poetic logic. And in his Scienza Nuova, in the new science that Joyce absorbed and loved, he said, this is what I discovered. I discovered a logic of poetry. I justify the role of poetry. Why? Because according to Vico, and this is the example he always goes back to, that is the function of Homer for the Greeks. And Vico, for instance, was one who believed that Homer did not exist, that there was no Homer. And maybe he was right, that there were many poets who called themselves Homer and added to what slowly was somehow layered and chosen as the main text of the Odyssey and the Iliad. For Vico, Homer was the spirit of the Greek people. And he was an invention like all the others. Homer was a sort of demigod invented by the people. But the logic of poetry is a logic of the body, and it is a logic of metaphor, and it is a logic of puns. So this is what Joyce understood. And he does that systematically with Finnegan's Wake, clearly, but also before. And so if literary language is infinite, would it not remove the need for iterability? That's a good question. Iterability is something that is structural. Let's put it like this. This is not something you can choose. Uh, iterability means that when I say a word, this word does not belong to me. Mm. When I say a word, I am repeating something. And iterability is the precondition of language, that it can be repeated. This is Derrida's main insight somehow, that language is made of difference and repetition. Difference because repetition. I mean, to give you a simple, the famous joke made by an American philosopher in a conference. Uh, Somebody said, you cannot negate a proposition in terms of philosophy by repeating twice a positive statement. You can say somebody says something, you can say no, you disagree, or you can question. And so someone who was probably a Derridian answered, yeah, yeah. Just the fact of saying, yeah, yeah, you repeat yes, but with a certain tone that makes it into a performative of your skepticism. Yeah, yeah. You negate what has been said. And so iterability is a structural condition of language. What remains to be seen is what kind of infinity uh, the poetic logic of Vico generates. I don't think that Vico would have understood this idea of infinity in language. Here, uh, and this is a long discussion, in order to understand this idea of infinity, and this is why in Finnegan's Wake, Joyce combines two Italian philosophers. The other one is Bruno, Giordano Bruno. And Bruno, yes, Bruno was burnt by the Inquisition in 1600 because he was defending the thesis of the infinity of the worlds in the plural. And so that is the other element that Joyce adds to the complicated mixture of history and language you find in Vico in his own practice of infinity. So, question about the is the experimental writing of the modernists like Joyce and T.S. Eliot also influenced by the founding days of cinema? Yes, I think so. That's a very good question. Absolutely. A lot has been done on Joyce and film. Uh, the philosophy of Bergson and early filmmakers like Lang and Eisenstein as in the montage. Yes, absolutely. My reading of The Wasteland and Finnegan's Wake suggested to me multiple languages, concept, myth, and worlds getting mediated through each signifier, thus overloading the same with multiple and different histories. Absolutely. The juxtaposition, not always, but mostly, such myth, words, etc., through and within each signifier suggested the cinematic montage to me. Yes. Are such reading correct? Yes, they are. Absolutely. And the potential to open modernist studies to the fin de siècle and early 20th century philosophy and early cinema. How much scholarly has been done across this field? Not enough, I would say. um, one fact that maybe you know, maybe you don't know, but I think is quite important for Joyce, is that Joyce opened the first cinema in Dublin in 1909. So that's it shows a very deep commitment to deploying the art of film into his native city. That's a very basic biographical fact. Let me rehearse this for those of you who may not know this. Joyce left Dublin the first time to go to Paris, and then he returned home quickly because his mother was dying of cancer. Then in 1904, the scene that is dramatized, you might say, in Ulysses, at least 1904, he met his future wife. They didn't marry, but they left together in 1904. And he went to Trieste, which was then part of the Austrian Empire. Trieste, at that time, was a very advanced city, very rich, big harbor, very modern, much more modern than Dublin. It's a very antiquated little village by comparison. And Italian cinema was on the rise at that time. It's something that hasn't often been said, but you mentioned Eisenstein and Lang, but before Lang and Eisenstein, there was French and Italian cinemas, but Cinecittà and so on, quite strong. And so Trieste, being within Austria but close to Rome and so on, had many theaters where people could see films. I want to mention this, and there are 2 or 3 books on this topic, but there could be much more. It's such a fascinating topic. And maybe you know the work of a good friend of mine who passed away unhappily recently, Laura Marcus. If you know her name, I'll just write her name. It's not so much on Joyce, but she has, I think, written extremely well about the links between modernism and film, and they are there, and you're totally right. Yes, absolutely. So Joyce learned very early about the power of film, and one of the, so in a long time ago, at a conference on Joyce in Italy, I think it was in Trieste or in Rome, we saw the films that Joyce had seen and some of the film that he brought back to Dublin. And it's something that is so fascinating because I have to say, we think today that film is a relatively simple, transparent medium. And so remember very well, there was a film, so there were, of course, silent films made in 1902, 3, 4, 5, 6, and so on. He went to Dublin in 1909, and it was the moment for Joyce of a big revelation that was in fact a lie. He thought that Nora had been unfaithful with one of his friends when they were dating at the beginning, and it created this extraordinary correspondence with Nora that was until recently censored, being too sexually explicit, and it's really very erotic. But this was also connected with that experience of launching the first cinema house in Dublin, the Volta, and it was Joyce's great project. Unhappily, because of all these personal trouble, Joyce didn't really work enough, and it was a commercial failure. But we could imagine had Joyce not had the misfortune of finding the need to return and settle his private affairs with Nora, he could have become a sort of impresario of the Irish cinema and could have become very rich and stayed in Dublin and launched an Irish industry of film like there was at that time, beginning in Hollywood, in Berlin, in Paris, in Rome, and so on. Uh, my point is this, just the reason why I'm mentioning this. When we watch those films, and the audience of specialists, we did not understand a thing. They were so opaque and so weird. And the principle of montage, of course, we all know Eisenstein. And Eisenstein, we know, had read some Joyce. He knew about Joyce. But Eisenstein, I would say, systematized in a sort of neo-Marxist dialectics, Hegelian at least, 2 images generating a third image and a meaning, and so on. This was already in those early films. There were a few funny uh, films, but suddenly you had a total freedom at that time. You could show a character transform into an animal and then back again at full speed and so on. So this delirious montage was the norm, and also very opaque actions. Uh, I remember the death of Nero. We could not discern who Nero was. It was so hard to see, which I think impacts a little bit Finnegan's Wake. So a lot has to be done there. And indeed, I would say that for me, film is a sort of condensation of so many strands. Psychoanalysis is also invented at the time, the same idea. Roland Barthes has seen that quite well. The space of the dark room, where something is projected on the screen is very different from the theater, in which you see characters playing in front of you. Uh, when you are in the theater, in the cinema, kinematic, and so on, you are also in a sort of drowsiness that is almost like you let your fantasy go onto the screen. And the fact that it is a screen on which an image is projected is very different from seeing characters in 3 dimensions and so on. So there is a lot to be done, and indeed, Bergson is part of it, and that's again something that can be discussed at some length, whether Joyce is Bergsonian or not. Uh, but at least for those of you who may have read Deleuze on film, the wonderful two books on film. One needs to think through Bergson in order to understand the links between modernism, a new philosophy of the image, a new philosophy of the unconscious, which is also in Joyce, and a certain practice of the film. So I think yes, the Joycenberg, the intersection of French occult revival with early cinema, psychoanalysis, and modernism, very interesting. Especially the occult often dealt with image making and manipulation. Absolutely. Yes, this is something I mentioned earlier, the work of Helen Sword, uh, um, on early spiritualism techniques and so on. Before even film was invented, many spiritualists were using photography and fake photographs, especially in England. There was a whole industry of what was called ectoplasms, uh, and it was very easy to trick people because they discovered that photography was quite simple. They would just graft onto the image of a medium, the picture of a little girl who had died, and so on, and say, here is the ectoplasm of your dead child, and people would believe it, and so on. So, indeed, there is this occult manipulation of the image. We have many traces of this in Ulysses. Why? Because Joyce was close to Yeats, and Yeats believed at that time in spirits, and he had in London, he was part of a theosophical society. They would do mediumistic seances and so on. And if you know Ulysses quite well, there are a few hilarious parodies of this, especially in the library episode of Ulysses. Joyce has a lot of fun with the language of the spiritualist, sort of the Madame Blavatsky was the right ISIS, and Joyce parodied that no and we know that Joyce and Oliver Gogarty Buck Mulligan would make fun of Yeats all the time. Here another question. I keep thinking of a role-playing video game with this labyrinthine game while reading Ulysses. Yes, that's a good idea, especially when it comes to the interpretation and performance of reading the text. I keep wondering if Joyce would change the medium, if Ulysses from a codex format to something more ludic in today's time. I'm also interested in knowing Derrida's own thought, if any, on the multiple pathways that a ludic narrative offers and the performity of the ludic experience. That's a very good suggestion indeed. And I would say maybe with Ulysses, it's a little more complicated, and the performance of Ulysses is something that is perhaps complex. And I am struck by the fact that a book like Ulysses has so far resisted good filmic adaptations. And that there are a few films, but none of them is really very convincing because there's too much in Ulysses. It's hard to reduce to a story, to a game. But at least what you suggest is absolutely true of Finnegan's Wake. Finnegan's Wake changes the reader's intervention in a text. Finnegan's Wake, one cannot read it like that. One has to play with the text. And so, indeed, whether it is a video game or a reading group or any new medium you invent, performance comes to the fore. I will return to this in a moment, talking about the interpretation of Ulysses Gramophone by Derrida. But yes, you're totally right. A ludic narrative, I mean, as we know, Joyce in Ulysses offers a very ludic narrative of all narratives. What you have in, especially in the chapter Oxen of the Sun, but also in chapters like Cyclops, if you know Ulysses, we could return to this. But you see Joyce, in a way, this is the moment in the novel when Joyce, somehow the chapters become 10 times longer than the earlier chapters. And you see Joyce playing with language, playing with culture, introducing parodies and so on. And then insisting, this is what I was referring to, the encyclopedic element of Ulysses. Basically, the vocabulary of Ulysses is extraordinary. Just look at the words used by Joyce, like sort of memory. This is what Derrida is referring to. We say Joyce sort of memory of culture, labyrinthian games. Yes, exactly. One can get lost in those labyrinth sets, and so the performativity, I would say, and this is again something that Derrida, I would say, takes from Joyce. There is a labyrinth. We can be lost in the labyrinth, but we are saved by performativity. I will just simplify in those terms. Performativity allows me to become, as it were, the co-author of the text. And to give you a good sense of what Joyce was thinking, he was thinking at some point that he could give over the text to someone else to finish, which showed that he could abandon his sense of authorship. So I think we can maybe take a little pause here. And I realize that there is a lot of material, but thank you for the excellent questions. And so I suggest 5 minutes pause and we meet in.
Thank you very much for responding to the request.
Yeah, you're welcome. Bye.
Okay, in the meantime, shall we quickly get our act together and switch on the videos for a while so that we can do the ritual, which I think all of you are now used to.
Hello.
Yes. Sorry, who's this?
It's Pyle. Yes. Can you give me 1 minute? I can log in from my mobile.
Sure. That's fine. That's fine. Yeah, I know the problem that you have. Yeah.
Sure. Yeah. Thank you.
Okay, let's wait a minute for her to join back in. I think,
Professor Chattopadhyay,
yes.
I had a question
So,
like about the tutorials. Like, do we have to complete that the tutorials by 24th?
just 1 second. Let me just take the picture and then we can discuss.
Okay, okay, of course, Professor.
Yeah, could you please switch on your videos, all of you? Yeah, that's great. Maybe others. Yeah, just for a minute and we'll take the picture. I'm still waiting for Nikhil, Anita, Geeta. Yes. Gulshan, Dheeraj. Okay. Okay. I mean, we have some here, so I think we'll go ahead. We'll have most of them here. Thank you so much. Thank you. Yes, Dr. Chakraborty, please go ahead.
Yes, Professor. Actually, I was asking that like about the tutorials that do we have to complete them by the 24th?
No, basically, so what's, yeah, let me take this opportunity to say this to everyone. So the idea of having tutorials was something that we had initially in the first plan when Jean-Michel was supposed to come here in person. We've changed that plan since this became an online course, of course, got delayed by, in fact, a couple of years, COVID and everything. So what he's doing now, if you notice with the tutorial texts, is he's in a way compressing them and discussing them inside the lectures. And there will be some more time tomorrow, I think, after the initial discussion of GLA, where we could go into some of the material again. There's nothing that do explicitly, actively for those, in fact, that's why I've changed the lecture plan text in the shared folder, if you notice. Okay. So there's nothing extra for the students to be done, for the participants to be done about those texts and about those hours. Yeah. Thank you. Does it make sense?
Yes, Professor. Completely. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so we can take a little bio break maybe and come back in 2 or 3 minutes. Yeah. Thank you, everyone. Hi, Jean-Michel. Shall we take maybe 1 more minute and then come
Sure,
back?
yes, absolutely. I am just looking at, yes. Very good. Thank you all for the great questions you are asking, and I can see that you have programs that are very productive. So I hope you can all use this as a starting point. So Aka, I'll let you tell me when you think I can resume.
I think we can get started unless, yeah, I can see
Very good.
is around. Yes, I think we can get started.
Yeah,
Yeah,
very good, very good. So I don't want to be too long, but since we I wanted to have a sort of double session on Joyce, I will mention here Ulysses Gramophone. And first of all, because I am a character in that uh, uh, wait, share this with you. Okay. You can see the text. Yes, you see the text, right?
Yes,
And so,
Professor.
yeah. So it is indeed a very surprising series of coincidences that brought us to this weird moment when, and so I had been in charge of inviting Derrida to a Joyce conference in Frankfurt, and my friend Klaus Reichert, who was in charge in Frankfurt, um, asked me on the phone to ask Derrida for a title. And then uh, he gave a title, Hearsay. Um, his title was Redeer the Joyce. And so he then, at the same time, I had sent Derrida, and it was more or less at the same time, but he hadn't got it yet. A book that was based on my dissertation with Hélène Sixou, and it ended with exactly the same title, Oui dire. And of course, I knew it when I heard Derrida's answer, but I couldn't say, look, sorry, I've used that as the title of my chapter. And then again, it was during another such chance meeting. I was driving along with Magda. I leapt out of my car in the street night at the site of Jean-Michel Rabate. I have to say that it was even more funny. It was one evening because at that time I would go to Paris twice a week to give talks, to lecture, and so on. And I was running in the street, literally very late, to rush and catch a train. And I think there must have been a subway strike, and Derrida almost ran me over. Such a weird coincidence. And then drove me, and we talked about Joyce at that moment. And so he's interested here in all those jokes, correspondences, and indeed the little joke that was quite funny was by Klaus Reichert, then pretended to mishear what Derrida was saying about his title. I'm very curious to know about Louis. The Louis have not been detected in Joyce, as far as I know. Indeed, there is no real character called Louis, and so on. So Derrida was trying to, we both had made a pun that only works in French. In French, oui, yes, is exactly homophonic with we, hearing, written differently, but pronounced the same. We. So both we had been, and it was not only our invention. a poet, had also written a collection, We Dear, and so on. Not such an original pun, I have to say. But then, because of that exchange via telephone and replayed by Klaus Reichert, Louis Dear, and so on. But the interesting thing is, We Dear in French is hearsay. And so hearsay is a good way of talking in what in French called téléphone arabe, in which you repeat a sentence, and then it's so distorted that when it comes back to the first speaker, it's so different, he cannot recognize his sentence. In poetry, it is an exercise that the Olympian members have practiced a lot. You take a poem, say by Mallarmé, you translate it into English. Mallarmé being very abstract, difficult, you will have another. You retranslate that poem, let's say in another language, till Japanese. You retranslate and so on. And then you come back at the end and you retranslate it into French, and you see that it's a completely different poem that at times has absolutely nothing with the original poem. So this is to say about translation, Babel, Towers of Babel, and so on. In this text, and I cannot be too long, you would need to read it. There is a lot. What I have to say is that in my own practice, it was quite astonishing, because when Derrida came to Frankfurt, I was with my friend Tina Kendall, who is also credited in the first translation, and we were ready to help him. And he gave us a text of like 100 pages. So what? This is your talk, 100 pages? Yes. They know. And they had, in fact, left Derrida a whole morning. And we thought, oh no, this will be, and he was going to read in French, Ulysse Gramophone. And so we spent the night, Tina Kendall and I, writing little condensed summaries, and every 15 minutes, he would stop and we would read that summary. Derrida spoke for more than 4 hours without a break. Maybe he had a break in the middle, and the audience was enormous, and people listened and so on. It is a very interesting text in the sense that you see how Derrida works with someone like Joyce, who has always accompanied him, and what he does is a series of what I would call thematic readings that are fantastic. Finds, for instance, he takes one passage in which Bloom imagines putting a gramophone, so this is the origin of the title, in a chapter called Hades in Ulysses. Bloom goes to the cemetery, and at the end, he has this idea, why couldn't we have in front of each tomb a little gramophone in which you would have the last words of the dead person? And so sort of funny fantasy he has. And so then Derrida looks at all the occurrences of the theme of calling on the phone, the telephones in Ulysses, all the machines of inscription, and there are many, Bloom at the telephone and so on. And then from this, he moves on to the famous ending of Ulysses with Molly Bloom's yes. And he wonders, how is that yes, I will say yes, which end the text. Is that a messianic promise? Is it a yes that has to be repeated? It's an extraordinary meditation on what constitutes the yes to life and yes to the text that underpins any literary project. And then he moves on to Finnegan's Wake, including traces of the future. Yes, everything has already happened to us with Ulysses and has been signed in advance by Joyce. And one could say that this is the moment when Derrida voices a certain irritation facing Joyce, the fact that Joyce seems to have anticipated everything we can say about him, and indeed, and then, so see, you have guessed, then he talks about so this is the moment of deconstruction here, because so far, it's a sort of fascinating series of thematic readings, weaving questions that are very Derridian, but you couldn't say that it is a deconstruction as he did with Husserl. Then came the sting, as it were, the American James Joyce Foundation. And Derrida was invited by the James Joyce Foundation, in a way, at least by this international conference in the name of Joyce, with all the Joyce specialists and so on. And this is where he is making fun, because at first he was explaining that he had come back from Tokyo, and in Tokyo he had bought books of how never to say no, how always to say yes, which is a very Japanese issue. It's very impolite to say no, but when you have to say no, you have to circumvent it, which interested Derrida. How do you say no, not saying no? How do you say no, which I think in all cultures is an interesting moment. You disagree, but you want to be very polite, and you will disagree in such a way that your no will be understood, but never be voiced as a no. Is it true of the yes? That's the question he's asking. But at the same time, and here I want simply, it's also connected to what I had told him about all those Americans who are the trustees of the Joyce Foundation. And you can see here a certain irony in Derrida. And how can you be a specialist of a text like Joyce? And would he be considered a specialist? I had to, who signs what in Joyce's name? The answer could not be in the form of a key or a clinical category that could be pulled out of a hat whenever a colloquium is requested. And he dramatizes his own intervention within the Joycean field as being that of a foreigner, because Derrida is not a specialist, and that he comes to give to the James Joyce Foundation both a certain confirmation and a criticism. Cutting across country, I shall only say 2 words on the double relationship. Therefore, on the unstable relationship with double tonality, instructs my reading and my rewritings of Joyce, this time beyond Ulysses, and my double relationship to this yes laughter. Yes laughter, we rire, we dire in French. We rire, we dire. Very similar term. My presumption is that I'm not the only person to play double relationship. It is instituted and required by the Joycean signature itself. With a certain ear, with a certain hearing, I can hear a reactive, even negative, yes laughter resonating. It takes choice in hypernesic mastery. See, here again, I reiterate this term, hypernesic, is not positive for Derrida. It is again derived from Plato, Phaedrus, the attack on writing as an artificial memory. And so this is what Derrida denounces as the illusion of the Joyce specialist who can think they know all about Joyce, all about culture, and the mastery is the key to that. The mastery and the institution. And as he says, Joyce is playing tricks against us, and he undoes the tricks, tour de tour, his ruses, his cunning, and so on. He undoes this mastery. Omnipotence remains phantasmatic. It opens and defines the dimension of phantasm. Joyce cannot not know this. He cannot, for example, not know that the book of all books, Ulysses of Phineas Way, is still a mere opuscule among the millions and millions of works in the Library of Congress, absent forever, no doubt, from the news agency in the Japanese hotel, and too lost in the non-books archive, expansion of which nothing to do with the library. From these considerations, he then questions one important idea, and which is in the sense of laughter, and the moment in which we have Stephen saying, I owe you, A-E, I owe you something, and he notes that in French, so this is the funny thing, I owe you, which is the, we know Joyce puns on AE, the name of a character who actually signed like this, poet. Stephen saying I owe you, and I owe you, which in French is O-U-I, oui. The permutation of the letter oui in French. And so this leads him to say that in Joyce, there is this laughter that is also the cunning of reason, you might say, and that for him is connected with his, so one of the first names of Jackie Derrida was Elijah, and so he feels like the biblical person who comes to the feast of the institution, and he then becomes a little like what Joyce was quoting, Ich bin der Geist, der steht verneint, when Joyce was talking about Molly Bloom, Ich bin der Fleisch, Joyce would say, Molly is the Fleisch that says bejaht, that says always yes, and maybe there is the Goethean enemy, Mephisto, and Mephisto was saying, I am the spirit that always says no. So the no of Derrida is the no as a performative no to the dream of performative competence. And this is how he ends his long text. You can imagine that the Joyce scholars who were gathered were quite shocked. Is that I return to you to the community of Joycean studies. Supposing a department of Joycean studies decide, under authority of an Elijah professor, chairman or chairperson, to put my reading to the test and institute a program, the first phase of which would consist of putting in table form the typology of all the yeses in Ulysses, and so on. The chairperson agrees, the chair, like the flesh, always says yes, little joke. La chair dit toujours oui. In French, chair, la chair. So you see Derrida punning in French, between French and English. Chairperson, la chair, qui dit oui. So Molly Bloom behind the chair as a male American professor. And he takes as an example, and I think it's a very good example here, to show the limitations of objective knowledge. He says, count the number of yeses in the novel, and especially in the chapter of Molly Bloom. Okay. And it is something I had done at that time, and it's complicated to explain, but I had told Derrida that I thought there should be 88 yeses, and in fact, not exactly. But of course, as Derrida says, what counts as yes? Could we have just the form yes? So we know that Molly Bloom often says yes, but at times you have words like eyes, and in eyes, since there is often a little pun, you could say that eyes contains yes. Yes is eyes, and so on. It's a yes laughter. And basically, it shows that you will never know exactly such a simple thing as the number of yeses in the text is impossible to ascertain. And so he then moves on to the question of the speech as the corpus of Joyce, this idea that there would be a corpus that could be analyzed with a competence that could be signed and so on. And he ends up by saying, yes, can we sign with a perfume? Fundamentally, what he rejects is this idea of a Joycean competence. I had told Derrida that among the people I knew, they were saying, how many times have you read Finnegan's Wake? How many times have you read Ulysses? And some people will boast, oh, I read Ulysses 5 times, I read Finnegan's Wake twice. And in order to be a good scholar of Joyce, one needs to have read Finnegan's Wake at least twice, which doesn't mean anything if you know what Finnegan's Wake is, because it's totally unreadable. Although, indeed, one can read it, and I have read it, I have to say, several times from beginning to end. But have I read it? What does it mean? So, anyway, Derrida is extremely skeptical, as you can see here, about this notion of literary competence that would be marked by writing, publications, by being tenured in department. And Derrida knew enough about the American system to know what a tenure entails. How do you measure competence in literature? And this is the theme he returned to a few times, given the fact that for Derrida, literature is an institution, and that this institution has indeed a very knotted relationship with academia. And we know how much today some famous scholars, and one of my very good friends to whom I owe a lot, Marjorie Perloff. I don't know whether you know of her work, extraordinary work and extraordinary productivity on American modernism and other things. She knows very well, and that's why it makes her work even more difficult. She knows very well that when she discusses a new collection of essays or poetry, immediately people buy it. And so or if you decide to teach a new novel and a new poem, then immediately the little press maybe that has published it will increase the circulation and so on. And so we buy books, or we tell our students to buy books in connection with a certain teaching practice. But how is it recognized? And here, facing Joyce, you can see that Derrida is extremely skeptical of the possibility of ascertaining something like a competence. And I think here, I stop here because at that time, maybe I would say it was a message that he meant for me, because it was a sort of delusion I myself was suffering from, the delusion of mastery, the idea that by dint of working, reading all the books, all the essays, I would master Finnegan's Wake. And this is a little what I believe for a while, that I would know everything about Finnegan's Wake, everything about Ulysses, and so on. The deconstructive edge brought by Derrida to this issue is that, no, there is a sort of utopia in Joyce of talking about the future. And I'm going to give you a last very rapid section of a text that here I will share Okay. If I can share it, there again, need to sit. So, which is from Two Words for Joyce. You can see it?
Yes.
Good. And so this sends me not to the conference in Frankfurt, but to 1982. I had arranged with my friend and mentor Jacques Aubert discussion between Jacques Derrida and Alain Sixou on Joyce at the Centre Pompidou. And the Centre Pompidou had been the place where the big conference on Joyce in 1975 had seen Lacan intervene on Joyce. In 1982, it was Derrida and Alain Sixou, and Derrida presented Finnegan's Wake as a revolutionary book. And as he said, he compared Finnegan's Wake with a computer. I have to say that in 1982, I don't know whether you know this, most of you were not born, but people did not have computers, or they existed, but the PC was not such a common thing. Most people in France started owning computers a little later. Derrida had one very early, an old Mac, very small old Mac. I mean, small screen, very big machine, and so on. However, I want to say this. Derrida said that Finnegan's Wake was an archive of the future. And I'll return to this tomorrow, this idea of texting and the fact that I believe that indeed Derrida anticipated something that we see today, every day. Today, I note that all my friends say, I told him this, or I said that, and they mean texting. We are texting all the time on our iPhones and so on, and we don't realize. We don't say email, we say texting, meaning we write, but we write to say. So Derrida had seen something like the proliferation of computerized programs, multiplication of applications, of new software, speed of information disseminated by constant technological revolution, new interfaces impacting the way we drive cars, reserve tickets, read novels, see films, make love or war. All this had been adumbrated, according to Derrida, by Joyce. Joyce, who had never heard of computers, of course, they were not really invented when he died, but invented with Finnegan's Wake something like a program. It's more a program than a text. In Derrida's formulation, Finnegan's Wake is an archive of the future that prevents anyone from stating anything about it that has not been programmed in advance. So he writes it. For you can say nothing that is not programmed on this 1000th generation computer, Ulysses Finnegan's Wake, compared with which the current technology of our computers and our microcomputerized archives and our translating machines remains a bricolage, a prehistoric child's toy. Indeed, Finnegan's Wake announces technologies that were just developing, like television, whose audiovisual properties are mine for a chapter. Joyce had noted the fact that American inventor Charles Francis Jenkins got a patent for his idea of television in March 1922, 1 month after Ulysses was published. Finnegan's Wake stages the explosion of a nuclear bomb, even though the weapon had not yet been invented. We hear one exploding in a page of the book. I evoked of the annihilation of the atom with molten escapings with molecules. Joyce gives due reference to Lord Rutherford, who split the atom in 1919, and we know that he was reading lots of scientific texts on the possibility of an atomic bomb. We know in the 30s it was something that people would talk about. Finnegan's Wake outdoes Ulysses in that it functions like a hypermnesiac machine. Its huge memory includes not only technology, but its present and future textual commentaries, all the while revolutionizing itself constantly. We soon learn to play its game, which resembles learning a language, and we discover exceptions to its pre-programmed rules. Joyce's works turn into encyclopedia of Western culture, while sending us to a future that we cannot comprehend, only imagine. And so I mentioned the Solers had presented Finnegan's Wake as a revolution in language, but he meant it in the avant-gardist sense. Derrida means it in the technological sense, the revolution of a new tool, a new technology, and so on. And it took Joyce 17 years to invent a synthetic idiom made up of more than 70 languages. He published his illegible text in installments called Work in Progress, serialized in little magazine like Transition, before giving birth to Finnegan's Wake. Joyce meant to keep a critical edge and to have an effect in the world of politics. I mentioned, so this is part of something else that I owe to Derrida as well. Thanks to Derrida, when I went to see him in so very early in 1968, 69, at the end of our discussions about Joyce, he told me, and at that time, he was just beginning to be known in France. He told me to work on Mikhail Bakhtin. At that time in France, and Derrida was close to her then, Julia Kristeva, who had arrived just before, knew about Bakhtin, had started introducing Roland Barthes to the work of Bakhtin. Soon after, Bakhtin's work on Rabelais was translated into French, and the work on Dostoevsky. And so this was very helpful for me to use Bakhtin as early as the late 60s to read a bit of Finnegan's Wake. And indeed, like Rabelais, this is also part of the laughter that Derrida was mentioning in connection with Joyce. This laughter has to do with the Bakhtinian body, and the body of the wake, the Irish wakes. In Finnegan's Wake is based on a song that refers to the practice of the Irish wake. In reality, the Irish wakes were often extremely bawdy, erotic, gross, and so on. People would be totally drunk. The idea of a wake in Ireland is an old pagan superstition. With this, somebody had died, and so that person was generally in a coffin, but the coffin was on a table around which everybody would eat and drink, and they had to spend the night, because the belief was that if they didn't help the soul be pacified, it might not reach its destination, as it were. And so, not a very Christian idea. This is why even Catholic priests didn't like the idea of the wake and tried to suppress this. It was the occasion, because people would get drunk, drinking all night. They would make games and so on. Those games at times implied taking the corpse and dancing with the corpse. So all this is part of Finnegan's Wake. We are invited to an Irish wake, a festive nightlife teetering upon the brink of excess. Merriment subsists through testimonies of bereavement, sadness, and discordant strife, interfering in the midst of a family gathering. Finnegan's Wake is always both funny and sad It's all about the death of somebody who is in fact not dead and who is awakened by the pop of a whiskey bottle, a whiskey cork. Giordano Bruno's motto, in tristitia hilaris, in hilarite tristis, which is so often quoted and echoed in Finnegan's Wake, meaning laughing in sadness, sad in hilarity, remains valid for Joyce. He said to his friend Harriet Weaver, who had agreed to play with him, and she would order certain texts. At the end, having finished his book, he said this kind of disabused and was almost nihilistic awareness. I know it's no more than a game, but it is a game that I've learned to play in my own way. And I think that defines Finnegan's Wake. He invents a game. Previous question was perfect there. Children may just as well play as not. The ogre will come in any case. And here we are back to the world of dark fables where the ogre will eat the children, that is, death will come. Sort of a pessimistic, disabused awareness that Joyce had perhaps wasted 17 years of his life, or perhaps found something absolutely new. And I would suggest in the end that there is a certain future in Joyce. Joyce imagined that, as he said, after Finnegan's Wake had been published, in a letter, he said, he mentioned the Russian invasion of Finland, followed by the stubborn resistance of the Finnish army. The most curious comment I've received on the book is a symbolic one from Helsinki, where, as foretold by the prophet, by him, the Finn again wake. Finnish, the Finn, volunteer Buckleys are running from all sides to shoot that Russian general. This is an allusion to a very bizarre, dense passage of Finnegan's Wake, in which we have a television show. So when television was not invented, it is the passage I was quoting earlier. You have an atomic bomb, and it's all about, in fact, it's based on the Crimean War between where the French and the British were opposed to the Russians and was sort of stalemate. But I'm insisting on this given today's historical situation. And I would add that if Joyce is right, and if he's really prophetic, this is scary, because Joyce would have prophesied that Russia might be soon using an atomic bomb. I hope it's not the case, but this remains a possibility. Of course, this is not Finland, but Ukraine. But if we reread Joyce's weird chapter of shooting the Russian general, based on a sort of bawdy story that Joyce loved, the story his father has told of an Irish soldier in the British army who goes to fight against the Russians and sees a Russian general who has isolated himself to defecate. Let's put it like this. And at first he's there with his gun and said, no, I cannot shoot a man who is naked like this, and so on. But then he sees that the Russian general wipes himself with grass, and then he finds him disgusting and he shoots and he kills him. And we know that when Joyce was telling that story to Beckett, the friendship with Beckett, Beckett said, oh, an insult to Ireland, because Ireland was represented by the green of green grass. That's why he killed him. And Joyce laughed and said, yes, this is it. I will use it like this. Joyce imagined that he was, in fact, rewriting the whole of previous histories with the hope that something would be coming for the future. He mentioned the future quite a lot in Finnegan's Wake. He plays, for instance, at some point on Wagner's idea of Zukunftsmusik, the music of the future. When Wagner was a young man, he wrote about a revolutionary position in music. This is, of course, a long discussion of Joyce and music and so on. But you have this weird little sentence, the music of the future on the barbarians of the Bashed. You see, we're quite typical of Joyce's punning system. The music of, we could say, if we translate it, the music of the future on the barbarians, barrel organs, orgue de barbarie of the past. But you could also hear mujik, barbarian, the mujiks, and the Russian peasants of the old Tsarist order giving birth to a new humanity rejuvenated by the revolution of the world. And of course, I want to insist on this in another passage, and I would not push it too far, but I mentioned the fact that Brexit, the term Brexit seems to be in Finnegan's Wake, and that Finnegan's Wake, of course, anticipated Brexit. And the interesting thing that Joyce could never have anticipated, and it's so striking when one is like me, a French person, part of the EEC, that because of Brexit today in the European Union, there is only one country who has English as one of its national languages, and it is Ireland. And we know how much it has helped Ireland in the last years, because at least most American companies have decided not to invest in England, but in Ireland, and so on. So this nice, neat reversal of the old colony. As we know, Ireland was always treated as the first British colony, and many others followed, including India. But I think in Ireland, the treatment of the Irish was really ferocious, savage, and ruthless and brutal. And Joyce was aware of that. And so, of course, he being an Irish man conditions a lot of what he had to do while writing in English and so on. You remember, same predicament as that of Celan writing in German, the language of the people who killed his parents, the language of the Nazis, and so on. Joyce, the language of the oppressor, clearly. But you can write against the language of the oppressor. In a way, this is not so much the point that Derrida makes here, and all the critical readings of Joyce are accurate and important, and we can return to them. But we say that, to conclude on this, what Derrida sees is in Joyce the danger of a mastery of the specialist, of the professor, something he always questions. And he found, of course, a little ridiculous, the idea that after a certain number of readings of the text, you know it, as if it was enough to read the text 10 times and then you would be a specialist and so on. There is also the danger in Joyce. In Joyce, there is also perhaps an illusion of mastery, an illusion of absolute knowledge, a Hegelian dream. This is why Derrida sees Joyce as a Hegelian, that there would be absolute knowledge as produced by a machine, the machine of Finnegan's Wake. And that, of course, he would deconstruct. But at the same time, what he sees in Joyce are the resources of this language that somehow keeps on producing ambiguities, new meanings, and so on, and will therefore never stop. Of course, it could stop if it is not read or not practiced or not played with. That's the danger. And Joyce was aware of that. It's a game. You can play it or you can not play it. But as Mallarmé would say, literature is the supreme game without which perhaps life is not really very meaningful. I'll stop here and stop sharing this and maybe take a few questions if there are questions on this. So as you can see, this the whole of Joyce, and I realize that we are supposed to talk about Blanchot, but it might be a little. I'll just say a few things about Blanchot. But are there questions? I think one very, very, very important issue here that I think Derrida was really for me the first to articulate strongly is this: you cannot have a mastery over literature. You cannot calculate the competence of a literary critic. And Finnegan's Wake, and so this is what I believe really. With Finnegan's Wake, we have a text in which one cannot reduce meaning, and so many Joyce scholars try to reduce meaning. All those who annotate the text and so on say, oh, we have to see that only the meanings that are verified by Joyce having quoted, read Sergeant Chatterbook are acceptable. We want to reduce the potential infinity of the text, which goes against the grain of what Joyce wanted to do. Of course, the danger is that then you can say whatever and associate in a totally crazy manner. That's a danger. But I prefer that danger to the kind of reductive, controlling mastery, the fiction of mastery.
They might be still sort of, articulating the question. So Jean-Michel, I was wondering if I could ask you maybe two slightly general questions which might emerge from today's discussion of especially the reading of novels a little bit differently from the reading of poetry that you discussed yesterday. So I was just wondering, especially with the reading of Joyce, as you took us through so in such great detail, the early readings, which were in a way mediated through Husserl and geometry, and the specific readings of Ulysses and Finnegan's Wake, more on the axis of translation maybe, and Ulysses more on the axis of the yes and the iterability of language. I was just wondering if we could bring these slices together and what happens when we bring them together. I mean, something that I've often noticed with especially Ulysses' Gramophone is this implicit thread of technology, which is not something that he develops to a very large extent, or this very interesting claim about the postal form of the novel. The fact that the novel has a postal form and it's like a postcard, which is not addressed properly, the address is not given, and all those plays that he makes. But with the iterability of language question, what kind of agency does that leave for the character? I mean, let's say the character of Molly Bloom, or does it give the entire agency to language, which is again one of those points of discussion and debate, of course, within psychoanalysis and deconstruction, right? I mean, this idea of the subject being a slave of language in a certain sense, at least driven by the signifier. So these are the two thoughts I had. Thank you.
Yeah, I think you're right to insist on Molly Bloom, because here in the text, basically, Derrida, and I would say would agree completely with Alain Sixou here, that this is Joyce's most exciting moment, Molly Bloom's monologue, and a certain feminine writing, and an assertion to the complexity of life by saying yes, yes. See, what interests Derrida, and I think this is something that complicates a little bit the position of Alain Sixou. For Alain Sixou, it's enough to say yes, yes to life. And for Derrida, you need to say yes, 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 yes. There's always a yes that will perhaps nuance, question, destroy the first yes. But given the fact that this yes is repeated, the the complexity of Molly Bloom, it's something that I had tried to develop following Derrida's hints, that as we know, and this is also something one can verify in any analysis of the genesis of the episode of Molly Bloom, we know that what Joyce did when writing that episode, after he had got the idea of getting rid of the punctuation and finding this idea of 8 long sentences unpunctuated with one period in the middle at the end of the 4th sentence, he kept on adding statements that would complicate the position of Molly Bloom. And we know this from Van de Card's analysis of the genesis of the episode. When Molly Bloom says one thing, let's say about politics, then Joyce adds another statement that contradicts it, so that we never know exactly what she thinks and so on. And so this is, in a way, meant to make her contradictory. See, she is on the side of the vibe, as Joyce said, who contradicts herself all the time and goes beyond contradictions, because she is indeed sort of power of life, life affirming, beyond the contradiction. So it is because of, and I'll return to that perhaps if I had time, on the neuter, in a way, more on the side of the neuter than on the side of the feminine. Whereas Hélène Cixous would see her on the side of the feminine. Derrida would see her on the side of the neutral, but doesn't make, it's not very, very different. I have a question here. Is Derrida, by making this statement, cannot have mastery over literature, also anticipating the post-theoretical turn as well? Critiquing often turns to overinterpretation and becomes suspicious of the text, and Joyce would also frustrate the interpreter who tries to have a competence over Finnegan's Wake. Is that also a push towards foregrounding the pleasure of the text as well? This is a complex question. Anticipate the post-theoretical turn as well. I wouldn't say that, honestly. Why? I mean, of course, it depends what you call the post-theoretical turn as well. I think it corresponds to a post-structuralist term. That is that what Derrida is always attacking is the illusion of some structuralists, let's say Lévi-Strauss, Todorov, and others, Jeanette, his good friend Jeanette, who had the illusion that you could construct a vocabulary and techniques to take the text, put it on the table, analyze all the elements, and you would know what it means. And so here, if by post-theoretical text, a turn, sorry, you mean something like a very personal, autobiographical mode of theoretical fiction, yes. I'd say, and indeed, that's what Derrida often does. He gives you his own fiction, and then he talks about his life, his travels, and so on. Yes, that is totally possible. And I'm just reading an excellent dissertation that's very Joycean in that sense and very theoretical, and in which the author, I'm not sure whether I can mention him here, but he is working on Derrida's postcard, and he is inserting himself into the text by saying that he thinks he is in the text of Derrida, which is wonderful fiction And why? Because he realizes that in his own life, he didn't have a father. At least his father disappeared, so therefore he feels he's a bastard, and he's the bastard in the text, and so on. So this is quite a mode of approach that is accepted by Derrida. But the question of overinterpretation is tricky here, because what I had suggested earlier is that there is no overinterpretation. The interpretation is always overinterpretation. And I think for this, I like a lot, and it's a statement that I hesitate to make, and I don't make with my students, but it comes from Finnegan's Wake. And in Finnegan's Wake, you have one character, Sean, with an annoying neo-fascist character. But Sean at some point say, "You understand? I overstand." See? So that's very Joycean. You understand? I overstand. Which is sort of, I dominate you. If you understand me, I overstand you. So you interpret, oh, danger, overinterpretation. I am going to restrict your sense of the infinity of the text. And that's a gesture that Derrida is always criticizing. In the name of what will you say that the text has to be bound to a certain set of limits and so on? And indeed, as you can see today, a little jokingly, of course, I said, well, maybe Finnegan's Wake is foreseeing Putin's use of an atomic bomb on Kiev. Okay, this is delirious, of course. We know that Joyce could not have anticipated that, but it belongs to the sense of a text that plays with history, in a sense, or passes through. So is that a push towards for granted the pleasure of the text? Yes, absolutely. But the pleasure of the text, remember, if by this you, I mentioned it, Roland Barthes' beautiful meditation. At the same time, if you know this, remember that for Roland Barthes, working with Finnegan's Wake would be more on the side of what he calls jouissance. The text of jouissance would be more Finnegan's Wake, meaning that it's a little too much, too excessive. You don't have like, what Barthes means by the pleasure of the text is a sort of, and that had been well treated by Antoine Compagnon in the book on anti-moderns, is what Roland Barthes was saying, well, in fact, I am a little fed up with all those experimental texts, Philippe Sollers, Joyce, Artaud, the revolution in language. Let me just enjoy a nice little novel of the 19th century, like Balzac, with traditional characters, and read them for my pleasure. This should be allowed as well. I'm not sure that this is what the Joyce is doing in Finnegan's Wake. There are a few passages like that, but really Joyce is relentless, and he pushes you to the sense that you will not have the mastery over a nice little plot and gentle characters and so on. He doesn't do that. He said, I could do it, but no. So he's more on the side of, say, Adorno's vision in at the end of his life, sort of work in progress. Everything is in progress with Joyce. So another question on the encyclopedic knowledge of the machinic archive of the future in Finnegan's Wake, and analog to the information overload. That's a good point. Absolutely. Big data, our post-truth era, in which real-life events like COVID-19 get unintentionally predicted by a dystopian American novel and a neo-noir film, Traffic. Yes, I mean, you know, this is why in culture is always a series of reiterations. I don't think it is unintentional. All those predictions. For instance, I taught a film, a silly film with Schwarzenegger called True Lies. And you may know it, quite a good film about the question of lies. And at some point, you see a plane crashing into a high-rise building. Say, oh, anticipation of 9/11. That happens. See, all those anticipations are there in culture. Why? Why? I mean, and here. It is because, again, culture functions like that. I don't know whether you know the famous text of Borges on Kafka and his predecessors. It's only, and this is also what Eliot is saying in Tradition and Individual Talent, the historical sense always works from the present. The present determines the history you will reconstitute. As Borges, following Eliot, shows, you read Kafka, and then you find predecessors, and these predecessors have nothing to do with one another, and perhaps are assembled by just your fancy, but they are indeed predecessors because given the introduction of Kafka as an event in the system of universal literature, you might say, then Kafka has predecessors. They don't know they were predecessors. Only from your point of view as a reader, will you put them together. Same thing with actual history. Also, is meaning ludic historical futurism yourself actually lost in the form machine? I don't think meaning is lost. See, meaning is multiplied. There's our times a more parallel with legacy and data and postmodern encyclopedism that subverts itself. How Joycean is this? See, I think what Joyce is reminding us via Derrida is this: is there a project like that of Husserl who was aiming at founding science, refounding science on what he calls objectivity and subjectivity working in tandem? Okay? Can one do that? And for Husserl, it was an important issue because he was trying to avoid a certain crisis of the European mind, and a crisis that, unhappily for him, culminated when his former student, Heidegger, cut him out from the library because Husserl was Jewish. You know what I mean there. And so, with Joyce, Derrida answers, Husserl's project is impossible. It will never work. If you think you will avoid the crisis of the European spirit by refounding science on this tandem between objectivity and subjectivity, then too bad, the future looks bleak. There should be another way, another way. It doesn't say what, but if you think that, if you keep on like the program of a sort of enlightenment, and if you think truth or the trust in truth, the trust in scientific truth, I agree with you indeed that it's a fundamental issue today in the world that people do not believe specialists, academics, professors, scientists, and so on. And you can always find a hack scientist who will say counter truths and try to prove that smoking is good for your health and so on, as we know with recent scandals in America in the 50s and so on, until the truth finally is so obvious that you can deny it. But Derrida is skeptical of the kind of rationalist profession of faith in the ability of putting together the subjective and the objective pole. So thank you for Protege. Fascinating mode of reading, exactly what I had in mind by post-theoretical. Overstanding. Yes, thank you. Yeah, I like that. See, the terrifying, it's a joke, of course, right? When I say, you understand. So see, you need to say it with a certain delay and just, yeah. You understand. Okay. And they are, if you say this to students, you understand, my little boy, you understand. And then you pat them on the head. I understand. Then suddenly you're brought back to a kind of Nietzschean moment of power and so on. Oh, in this something that Derrida would a funny little performatives that I saw him do in several occasions, and it's quite strong and at times a little too strong. Somebody would ask, and especially among philosophers, you may know, I've been in many conferences where philosophers will be given the microphone and start a long-winded question and speak for 10 minutes and basically forget the question and talk about what they are writing and so on. And then at the end, you don't know what the question is. And Derrida would very often, and it works only in French, I think. It was really in the French context. He would say, "Vous avez raison," meaning you are right, or you have reason with you. We would say it slowly, "Vous avez raison." Next question. Meaning, okay, you have your reason. Play with it. Yeah, it's not what I'm doing or saying. Okay, yes, question. Found Gustav Meyring, the French tradition, the fantastic. After I found Kafka. Yes, unfortunately, Borges didn't like Meyring, and I'm not aware of his view of the French fantastic. I don't think that Borges knew the fantastic tradition in French very much, but Borges had read really so many things, mostly, I would say, in the British tradition, more than in the French tradition. Borges, who had a great French culture, liked in French, from what I understand, the lyrical tradition of poetry, but not so much the prose, with some exceptions like Proust he had read, but some more French on the side of the par cœur, learning by heart, and so on. Borges would be a good case in point for what we were saying earlier, precisely because, as you may know, he was blind from a relatively early age. He tried to keep a memory of the text he loved. And I saw this from a friend who actually died not so long ago, who was in charge of the Pleiad volumes. I think I mentioned that. No, I think I didn't mention it. I might repeat myself here, but so anyway, this French specialist who knew Borges very well would play games of quoting poems to one another, and it's the same with Joyce. Joyce, when he came to Paris, it's a little anecdote, but find it interesting. He came to Paris in 1920, and he admired, he saw all those interesting writers and so on. He liked the poetry of Valéry, we know, and Joyce would often ask his French friends, "Oh, you're mentioning a poem. Can you recite it to me?" And the French could not. Joyce was really astonished. What? You don't know it by heart? Joyce imagined that, and he did it. Like, he liked a few poems by Verlaine, and he could recite them. If you liked something, you would know it by heart. Borges was the same. If of course, and he would ask, and I know that this French friend was often, oh, well, I have to rehearse and so on. And he was testing his memory. And so this is a little what Derrida, it's a sort of traditional idea here. But the idea is that if you really love a poem, it should be in you. It should be written in you. And this is memory. Well, I realize that we haven't had time to talk about Blanchot. I will leave this for next time, tomorrow, right? So,
Jean-Michel, just a very quick, clarification for everyone here. I think there was some questions during the break about this as well. So we are actually integrating the tutorials in the lectures. The idea was initially to have 12 hours of lectures in the morning and then 3 hours in the afternoon, when the plan was to have this in person. But we are actually doing the same 15 hours here. It's just that we are doing it in a different way rather than the morning afternoon break thing. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. Unless, I mean, tomorrow we can take a little more time. I guess we don't have to be limited, and because I'd like you take a look at GLA. Of course, unhappily, you don't have the new translation Klang, that is not so different, but a little different. But anyway, the first translation is very good. It's not that they, actually, the new translators, David Wills and Jeff Bennington, recognize that it was a great translation, but they want to do something a little different, because it is something that I want you to think through, is what was Derrida trying to do with GLA? Why did he produce this slightly monstrous book made of parallel columns and so on? So this is really, I'd like you to tell me what you think, because it's a new project. I don't think anyone has done that. I don't think it wants to rival with Finnegan's Wake. It's more a philosophical book, or maybe a poem, or maybe a modernist attempt. I don't know how to call it. It is a radical project. Some people hate it, some people love it. It has created a lot of like rewritings and so on. But I think if you understand that this is maybe Derrida at his most experimental and creative, you will see something that may have to do with also the format of the book and so on. So I want to talk about this. And with Blanchot, a lot depends upon whether you have read Blanchot or not. And I have to say, I could not in even an hour give you a sense of what Blanchot has done. And indeed, I think, and so I mentioned Blanchot here and there, but we need to understand the role of Blanchot for Derrida, and the interaction between Blanchot and Derrida. So this is the last. I hope the two will work well together tomorrow.
That sounds wonderful. Thank you so much. We are all
You're welcome.
forward to the last lecture. Okay.
Very good. Okay.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
See you tomorrow. Thanks again for your attention.